They told him a man who works with trees all his life eventually forgets how to talk to people. But the day the lonely lumberjack stepped into that dusty back alley auction and quietly laid down $2 crumpled for a woman with a sack tied over her head, the town swore he'd lost more than just his mind. What nobody knew was that this wasn't a purchase. It was the beginning of a promise, a rescue, and a mystery so deep it would challenge everything they believed about love, freedom, and the price of dignity. Before I tell you how a shy man with calloused hands ended up marrying the woman everyone else treated like property, make sure you subscribe, because what's coming next will twist, break, and then rebuild your expectations in ways only the best true to life stories can. The lumberjack had lived alone for 9 winters in the cabin he built with his own hands, the kind of place that creaked in storms and smelled like pine sap and coffee grounds, sitting on the edge of a forest that swallowed sound and gave nothing back except work. People in town called him Eli because nobody remembered his last name anymore, and Eli didn't correct them, because forgetting had become easier than explaining. He woke before sunrise, swung an axe until his shoulders burned, hauled logs for men who barely noticed him, then walked home under the tired sky with only the company of birds and his memory of a past he never spoke about. He had watched families build lives while he stacked lumber that built their houses, had watched new husbands brag and new brides laugh while the sawdust collected on his boots like quiet humiliation. And sometimes at night he would imagine a voice inside the empty cabin saying his name, not because it needed something, but because it cared whether he existed at all. That Saturday, when he wandered into town for salt, nails, and perhaps the simple comfort of hearing other people argue about weather and politics, he heard the murmuring crowd before he saw the makeshift platform behind the feed store, where the auctioneer's voice cracked like a whip against the walls, selling off busted tools, broken wagons, and then, like it was nothing, a human being. She stood with her wrists tied in front, a burlap sack knotted over her head so tight it left faint indentations along her neck, and the townspeople stared as if she were a problem to be solved cheaply, not a life to be handled gently. And Ely felt something in his chest clench the way wood splits along its grain, because the only thing colder than winter is watching people forget each other's worth. They said she was some drifter's debt, a trouble somebody wanted gone, a risk not worth more than the coins jingling in pockets. And when the bids stalled at $1 and then silence swallowed the yard, the auctioneer laughed, irritated, kicking dust over her shoes like she was clutter. Eli didn't know her name, didn't know her story, and honestly didn't know why his hand went up, but he remembered how it felt to be looked at like a burden once, long ago. And the memory burned enough that he reached into his pocket and pulled out 2 worn bills, the last of the week's money, and said in a voice so steady it surprised even him, 2. The crowd chuckled, the auctioneer shrugged, and just like that, the ropes were shoved into Ellie's calloused hands, as if a human life could be transferred like a shovel or a mule. And the woman swayed slightly, unsure whether this new man was another cage or something else entirely. Eli didn't drag her. Instead, he loosened the knots a little so she could breathe easier, whispering that no one would hurt her now, and the auctioneer rolled his eyes as if kindness were bad business. When Eli led her away through the alley, people muttered that the quiet lumberjack had finally snapped, but Eli ignored them, thinking that if goodness was madness, maybe the world needed more of it. On the walk back toward the cabin trail, the woman stumbled twice, not from weakness but from the weight of fear, and he could feel it vibrating in the rope like a live wire. Every time she faltered, he slowed. He didn't rush to remove the sack. Not yet, because he wanted to be somewhere safe first, away from eyes that had already judged both of them. The forest opened like a cathedral of shadows and light, the late afternoon sun slipping through branches like gentle fingers. And though neither of them spoke, something shifted in the silence, the understanding that sometimes rescue begins quietly, without grand speeches, with one person simply refusing to leave another behind. At the cabin, he cut the rope carefully, like he was untying years of humiliation instead of knots, and told her that she could choose whether to reveal her face now or wait, that nothing would happen unless she wanted it to, and the words sounded rough coming out of his mouth, because he wasn't used to them, but true all the same. She stood still for a moment, hands trembling, breathing unevenly under the sack, then lifted it just enough for light to touch her cheeks, and though he still couldn't see her eyes, He caught a glimpse of scars that looked like old stories carved by other people's decisions. Ely turned away on purpose, giving her privacy in a space that had never needed it before, and wondered if maybe saving someone starts with not looking when they're most ashamed. He cooked beans and bread, placed the plate on the table, and said she could rest in the bed while he took the chair, which shocked her more than the journey did, because the world had taught her to expect commands, not options. As night fell, owls spoke from the treetops and the stove ticked softly, and though neither of them slept easily, something like safety hovered in the room, fragile but real, and Ely realized he had not bought a woman. He had bought the chance for both of them to start telling the truth. In the quiet, he thought of the future he never dared to imagine. One where people were not traded and hearts were not collateral, and he didn't know that tomorrow, when she finally spoke her name aloud, it would begin a chain of events involving secrets, debts, and a past tied dangerously close to his own. But for now, he only knew that $2 had never felt like such a heavy, righteous burden in his life. Ely woke before dawn. The way years of work had trained his bones, and for a moment he forgot there was someone else in the cabin, until he heard the soft movement of feet across the floor, careful. Like a deer learning the shape of a clearing, the woman stood near the door with the sack folded in her hands, not on her head anymore, and though her face was still shadowed by the low light, he saw eyes that were cautious but not broken, like embers refusing to die. She asked, in a voice sanded thin by silence, whether he expected her to cook, clean, or pay off some debt, and Ally shook his head and said the only thing he expected was honesty when she was ready, because he believed every person deserves the dignity of choosing their own story. That answer confused her more than any command would have, and she stared at the floor, as if searching for the trap that usually followed kindness, then admitted she had nowhere else to go and didn't know whether safety was something real or just a word people used before hurting you. Ely told her the forest doesn't rush a wounded tree back to life, it just stops the cutting and lets time do the rest, and he promised that until she chose otherwise. The cabin was her quiet place. Outside, the town was already whispering that the lumberjack had taken home trouble, and a few men were betting on how long before the sheriff came knocking. But Ely split logs with the calm of someone who had already decided who he was going to be. That afternoon, while the soup simmered and the wind calmed through the pines, she finally gathered enough courage to sit at the table and tell him one simple thing, her name, and the second it left her lips, his hand froze mid-air, because the name carried a past he recognized, like an echo from a mistake he thought the world had buried. He didn't show it, not yet, but inside he knew the $2 had bought him more than responsibility, they had bought him a crossroads. And whatever came next would test whether compassion was truly stronger than the ghosts both of them had been running from. The name lingered in the air like sawdust after a cut, floating, settling into every corner of Ellie's mind, until he finally remembered where he had heard it before: a ledger, a lawsuit, a land dispute that had cost half the town their tempers and one desperate family everything they owned. He kept working through the day, chopping and stacking, pretending the rhythm of the axe could drown out the truth forming in his chest. But the story kept threading itself together. Her father had borrowed from the wrong men, lost the farm, disappeared, and she had been passed along as collateral in a chain of cruelty that treated people like receipts. When he came inside, she was mending a tear in her dress with thread he'd left on the table, her hands steady despite the weight of what she had confessed earlier. And he realized she wasn't fragile, she was exhausted from surviving. He told her gently what he knew, expecting anger or shame, but instead she stared at him with a tired kind of relief, because secrets only grow teeth when they stay buried. They sat in the quiet for a while, the fire clicking like a clock, and slowly a plan took shape, not to run, not to hide, but to face the men who had turned her life into a voice and make them answer for it. Ely understood this meant trouble, maybe even blood. Yet he also understood something deeper. Loneliness had made him careful, but compassion was making him brave. When night came, he sharpened his axe not for the forest but for the road, while she folded the sack that once covered her head and set it on the shelf like a relic of a past that no longer owned her. And in that simple motion, the cabin felt different, like a place where choices lived instead of chains. Side by side, not as captor and collateral, but as two people who had decided that the truth deserved daylight. And when they reached the sheriff's office, Ely placed the $2 on the desk and said he wasn't here to return anything. He was here to report the selling of a human being like livestock. The sheriff, who had grown comfortable ignoring the powerful men behind the auction, shifted uneasily as the woman spoke her name clearly and calmly, telling how each debt had been twisted into another rope around her life, and for the first time someone wrote it down as testimony instead of rumor. Word spread fast. By noon the crowd gathered, not for an auction but for answers, and the men who had profited from misery were dragged into the open by their own paperwork, their ledgers suddenly looking less like business and more like confession. When the judge arrived from the neighboring county and declared the auction illegal, the town was forced to face itself, and in that uncomfortable silence Ely realized that sometimes justice doesn't roar, it simply refuses to keep pretending. A month later, after hearings and signatures and apologies that came too late, the woman chose to stay, not because she owed Eli anything, but because life beside him meant being seen rather than owned. They married quietly beneath the tall pines, without spectacle, with vows that sounded more like promises to protect each other's dignity than fairy tales. And when people later asked Eli why he'd spent $2 on a stranger with a sack on her head, he would smile the way a man smiles at a tree finally standing straight again and say he hadn't bought her. He had paid the smallest price imaginable to remind the town, and himself, that love is never a transaction and freedom is never up for sale.